Who is Jesus? It's the question that we've asked every week as we have journeyed together through the signs of Jesus. Who is he? Is he some great man? Is he some wise teacher? Is he someone who brought us something good to follow or a few good rules to obey? Or is there something more to Jesus than that? The first sign was Jesus turning water into wine. And what we saw there was that in Jesus we find abundance, completion. God gets to party with his people. We have direct personal communion with the living God. The second sign was the official's son. That now salvation is by faith in Jesus. The miracle happened, the sign happened, and his family believed. That points to the hope that we all have when we choose to follow Jesus. Last week, we looked at the healing at the pool. What we see in that sign is that the creator of the Sabbath wants our heart. It was the first sign where we sort of begin to notice not only the crowd's attitude, but if we're not careful, our own attitude in the way we treat Jesus, and we become more interested in the miracle than we do the giver of the miracle. Jesus confronted the man at the pool later and said, "See, you're still sitting. Stop, or something worse is going to happen to you." That we can pray and we can yearn for a sign, some sort of healing, but what Jesus really wants is our hearts. What he really wants is for us to follow him. And so today we look at the feeding of the 5,000, and it's a pretty famous story, isn't it? If you know a few Bible stories, chances are this is one of them. This sort of makes the rounds, one of the great Jesus miracles of all time. Because as the translation that we had on the screen begins to hint at, and some other translations do really well at pointing out, there were 5,000 men there. And the majority of those are probably married, and we're assuming each of them had a few kids. So it's not a stretch to say, between 7,000 and 11,000 people, I mean, give or take, how many were married and how many had kids. So Jesus, with some little kids' sack lunch, feeds a crowd of 7,000 people, 8,000 people, and then points us not just to the miracle, but to the sign that something we're supposed to believe in. So let's look at, again, the act as we have in weeks past, and then the sign, what is it pointing to, and then the foreshadowing. So Jesus withdraws, if we open up to John chapter 6. We find out that what Jesus is actually going to try and do is withdraw his disciples, get them out of the busy life of ministry, and have a quiet, private time just then to teach, to reflect, to grow. And so Jesus withdraws to a mountainside. He takes his disciples with him and have a little cabin in the woods, and they go up there to have just a staff retreat time. And John makes quite clear early on in the story that Jesus is gaining popularity and that some sort of confrontation is going to happen. So perhaps part of this withdrawal is not only teaching and the training of the disciples for further ministry, but a chance for Jesus to withdraw and within himself say, what is God's mission for me and how do I stay focused on that? Because it's easy, once popularity and the hype starts happening around you, to get sidetracked with what God has called us to do. So Jesus withdraws, and at least his original intention is to teach the disciples, this is what it means to have a life with God. This is what it looks like for those that want to honor God with the way they live. And wouldn't you know it, as often happens in life, in relationship and community with other people, something that throws a bump into that plan. That we can plot out what the next week or month or year is going to hold for us, and yet invariably something comes into that space and disrupts that plan. So Jesus withdraws to teach his disciples, and yet the crowds follow. They continue to come. They're pressing in, saying, we can't get enough of this guy. And so Jesus says, well, perhaps the best teaching method is showing by example anyway. So rather than continue to withdraw further up the mountain, he turns to the crowd and says, look, you want to know what ministry is like? You want to know what life is like? You want to know what it means to follow me? Here's a group of people who are hungry for the truth. Let's feed them. So he poses a question to the 12. He turns to them as he looks at the crowd of 8,000 and growing and says, we should feed them, no? And the disciples sort of miss the question, don't they? They look at the crowd and say, that's a lot of mouths to feed. That would take almost a year's wages, Jesus. Maybe you do need to retreat and catch up on your sleep a little bit, because looking at 8,000 people and saying, give them something to eat, well, Jesus, that's crazy talk. Well, one of his disciples points out that a boy brought 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good is that, feeding 8,000 people? And the loaf, we might think of, well, he brought a loaf of bread, he's at least got something, but these were personal loaves. In a sense, it was a sack lunch. His mom getting ready to send him off to school, packed him a sack lunch. Today's kids might take a Lunchable. So Jesus looks and says, look, we've got 1 Lunchable and 8,000 people, let's go ahead and feed them. We sort of understand the disciples' skepticism, don't we? Jesus, look, let's face it, you've done some pretty incredible things, but you're going to take 1 Lunchable and feed all of these people? You think you can take that, and I don't care how small you break those pieces of bread, Jesus, you're not going to get to feed everybody, even a bite, let alone a substantial meal. But the disciples, understandably doubtful, exercise a great amount of faith and go ahead and listen to Jesus anyway. Perhaps the first sign for us that even in the midst of doubt or fear, or how on earth is this going to happen, sometimes we have those commands from Jesus we need to obey whether or not they make sense. So they gather the people, they fit them into groups and they sit down. Jesus prays. Not only does everyone eat, but they pick up an abundance of food, more than Jesus began to break in the first place. And if you're sitting there, and you were lucky enough, because a crowd of 8,000 doesn't fit in a space like this. So imagine how far back the people are sitting, and they may not catch everything that's going on up front. But if you were lucky enough to have a front row seat, you see Jesus unwrap the Lunchable and start to break it, you have to think, shouldn't that piece of bread be gone by now? And he just keeps breaking. And the disciples keep distributing. And the people keep eating. And then Jesus goes to the fish. And you think, that fish was not that big. How is there still fish coming from this guy's hands? And you begin to capture that something extraordinary is going on. And I love the way this story ends. Jesus leaves because it says he knew the heart of the people. And they wanted to make him king by force. Think back to your school days, high school. Everybody wanted the class president that promised soda in the drinking fountains. We're going to have ice cream and cookies for lunch, a 2-hour work day, and no homework. That's my platform vote, Justin, for school president. Sort of think that's what the people wanted to do with Jesus. And then I stop and I think, sometimes I think, that's what I want from Jesus too. And if I somehow ask nice enough, or if I can beg or plead or try and present my case well enough, Jesus is just going to give me whatever I want. Look, you gave these people bread and fish. You can clearly do anything you want, so Jesus, give me this. But we realize the propensity within ourselves, because we see ourselves placed in the crowd. They're wanting more signs from Jesus. not more of Jesus. And those are two greatly different things. Our own hearts struggle at times, wanting Jesus to give us miracles so we can claim the pleasure of having received a miracle. Not because we hunger and thirst for more of Jesus. The crowd wanted a cool class president, someone who could promise them great extraordinary things and deliver. Not somebody who could teach them and mend their hearts and make them receptive to the way God was working. Well, that's sort of the act. That's the physical miracle. That's what happened. But John tells us each act, each miracle is actually a sign. It's pointing to something. So what is it pointing to? Well, John actually gives us a little bit of help on this one. If you turn to chapter 6, which is where we read, but flip over to verse 25, we get this sort of explanation of what it looks like for this sign to take root in our own lives. Jesus teaches that those that desire leadership, but even more those that desire to genuinely and authentically follow God, much is going to be expected of you. The bar is set high for those that say, I choose to follow Jesus. This isn't what's the lowest common denominator. This is Jesus calls us to a high standard, a high bar, a high measurement of success. And he withdraws the disciples, perhaps to say, there's something important for those that want to follow me about having a vibrant prayer life. Having a good devotional time. Make sure you are rooted in me. But it's also coupled with Jesus demanding action from his followers. Those that choose to say, I follow Jesus, realize that they have to be people of action, influence, and direction to those around them. That it's not enough to have a quiet prayer time early in the morning or a rock star devotional. Man, I spend an hour in the Bible. There are a lot of us today that know what the Bible says and yet fail to do it on a consistent basis. And Jesus, as the bread of life, is teaching us, look, when people come to you and are hungering and thirsting and wanting to know more, it's not enough to say, I prayed this morning. You have to act, you have to serve, you have to give to them. So what we read in John, beginning in chapter 6, verse 25, and following all the way to verse 59, is that Jesus begins this whole idea is that there's this temporary bread, and there's this eternal bread. And one is going to fill you for a short time. You can go home and buy your own personal loaf of bread, maybe some King's Hawaiian sweet rolls, and you can eat the whole thing, and you're going to be full for a while. But after a few hours, the pain and the hunger are going to start to return, and you're going to need more. And Jesus says that's just sort of the way and the rhythm of the earthly life. Things come and go. There's an ebb and a flow. There's a give and a take. You can quench your thirst. You can cleanse the hunger pains, but they're always going to return. And yet, in me, there's something that continues on forever. In me, that pain, that ache, that hurt, that thing that you've been carrying around that you just can't seem to quench, it's because you're trying to fill it with all the wrong things. I am, Jesus says, the bread of life. And in me alone is there satisfaction. And I have to admit that of all the weeks I would like to preach a sermon on Jesus as the bread of life, this is not my first choice. To give you a quick recap of our week with as hopefully few tears as possible. I was meeting with someone who was beginning to ask those sorts of questions. Look, I've known Jesus a while, but I want to follow him better. What does it look like for me to follow Jesus? And so we're meeting and we're talking and we're discussing and bouncing ideas and saying, what does it look like for you to be faithful today? What is God calling you today? We don't often need to start with the biggest, most grandiose dreams of, this is how I'm going to change the world. What matters is we say, what is God calling me to today to exercise faithfulness? Because you're not going to get God-sized responsibilities if you can't exercise faith in the small stuff. And so as we're processing that, I get a phone call from Elise who says, Justin, something's not right. We need to go to the hospital. So I go racing back home, and we throw her and Jackson in the car, and we're racing. And as we get in the car, the first song on the radio, it just happened to be on Caleb. The opening song, as I turn the ignition of the car on, opens with, to everyone who's lost someone long before it was their time. And then a sinking feeling hit. And God, you can't play that song now. We went to the hospital. We were there for about 4 hours. Came home, and the song that was in the radio as we were driving home was the one we sung today called Cornerstone, that opens with, my hope is built on nothing less. And there's a flood of emotion that overtakes you to say, God, if you're really the bread of life, why does this happen? It's sort of one thing to look and have friends that have experienced what Elise and I are going through. We had a couple in seminary that we were really close with that went through that. And you can look, and as a parent, you can sort of conceptually say, man, that really sucks. But until you're actually the one needing to wrestle with and process through those emotions, there's just this sort of barrier or divide that you can't explain until you've been there. And I do know that at times it has really shaken the faith of those that have gone through that. Look, if God really was that loving, that compassionate, that generous, that grace-filled, that wouldn't have happened. And at least to date, I haven't experienced that. My faith is steady because I know Jesus is the bread of life. And as we're riding home in the car, and this song is playing, the emotions are flooding in. I don't claim that my experience to somehow be normal or normative for those of you out there experiencing any sort of pain or loss or grief. But I can tell you from personal experience, there's a God that loves you. There's a God that created you, that desires to be with you, that as He looks at you and you struggle and toil and fear and try to quench whatever it is hurting inside. He's looking, saying, child, that's not going to give you eternal satisfaction. Come to me. Experience the bread of life. So what's the foreshadow? What does Jesus promise to us? Well, first, I think we can look back to the act, back to the miracle. We are going to have enough. In fact, more than enough when it comes to a life with God. That we may approach God when we take that step of faith and say, look, God, here's all I have to offer. I'm not that particularly skilled or talented, or at least I don't feel like I am. God, I don't know what you have for me, but here's my gifts. Okay? Jesus, here are the gifts. When I come to you, take them and use them. And what Jesus reveals is that is more than enough, because He has equipped and called each one of you with what you need to live for Him. So you may wake up in the morning and feel like, God, all I've got to give you today is a Lunchable. And He's going to say, that's okay, that's enough. I can work with that. If you are willing to come before me and honestly submit that, I can work with that. That when Jesus works in us and through us, we have more than enough. Second, that everything that God started in the beginning is coming to a completion. That ever since the first sin entered the world and people have been struggling to make themselves right with God and with each other, we've screwed up more than we've gotten right. And yet Jesus is saying, in me there is completion, in me there is hope, in me there is everything that God's story has been about is going to find its full joy. Come and eat the bread of life. Third, that by partaking in a life with Jesus, we experience God's eternal life. to this first point, that we're not only going to have enough, we're going to have more than enough. This life isn't something that starts at some point, predetermined time in the future when you die. It's the capability and the capacity to start now. You don't have to wait until your deathbed to have life with Jesus. It's something that's available now. For anybody who desires to follow and walk the Christian life, it's all about how you decide to follow Jesus now. This last weekend, sort of the process and flood of emotions was the third year anniversary of the death of my best friend growing up. And a lot of you have heard me tell at least part of his story before. And as I'm thinking on this and now going through my own tragedy and wondering, where is all of this going? Processing his emotion at his funeral. I sat down to journal, to write, and try to help process. And part of what made it difficult, at least in that particular experience and time, was I walk into the church for the funeral, dressed in my suit and ready as a pallbearer, and look at the front of the sanctuary, and I just didn't lose it. It was something I expected, but my mom comes up to comfort me and says, "What's going on?" I said, "The last time I stood in this church, it was wearing a suit, and it was for his wedding." And to have sort of those two competing images as some of the last memories of my friend just hit you in ways you can't prepare for. So, processing his death after the funeral, I just tried to express my feelings and my emotions, and then with what's going on this week in our lives, reflected on this. So, I offer this to you as a closing. I remember shortly after landing in Atlanta the second time, going for a walk with my wife. And through the pain and the tears, I said to her, "I just want to yell. Why? Why does this happen? Why is the world so broken and fallen? Why does the world look like this? Why does it end like this? Why does a loved child of God die in such a horrific way?" I sat with him as he died of cancer. And after I said that to Elise, I then thought for a moment and felt in my spirit that God was asking the same sort of question. God's heart was broken in that situation as well. He's broken in our situations. Whatever it is we are facing that just seems insurmountable, God's heart breaks with us. This wasn't the way God had planned it. This wasn't how the world was supposed to be. God created the world and humans to live in a different sort of ending. But the touches of pain and sin are everywhere. And then as part of my thought process, I said, now am I saying that my friend died because of sin? No. At least not in some personal way, like God is punishing him for this sin. But maybe I am in a grander, cosmic, eternal sense. My friend couldn't escape the general fallen nature of the world that we live in. A world that God, quite frankly, didn't create. And both his story and now the events in this past week continue to shape me. This story, this event, this realization is a part of what keeps me going, at least personally, for the mission that I think God has called me to. I've tasted the bitterness of sin and death, and quite frankly, I hate it. I love that God has, as John says in chapter 1, pitched his tent with humanity, is identifying with them, and is redeeming them from the depths of hell, sometimes the worst of which we create ourselves. And the message that the world needs to hear, that they come and gather around Jesus to know more about, is that death doesn't have the last word. That there is a greater hope out there, available here and now. That we can, in a very real sense, live and commune with the Creator of everything, every second of the day. And I want to be a part of a community of Jesus followers that take that message of hope and peace and reconciliation and joy to a world that just so desperately needs it. There is the bread of life eternal available to us. Let's pray.